January 17th, 1943. Stalingrad. Minus 32 degrees Celsius. The frozen Volga River stretched like a pale scar beneath the gunmetal sky. Snow fell in silent curtains over the skeletal remains of apartment blocks, their blackened walls jutting from drifts like broken teeth. In the basement of a collapsed factory on the city's western edge, Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin pressed a gloved hand against the frost-cracked wall and listened. Above the wind's howl came something else, the grinding of tank treads, the sharp crack of rifles, and beneath it all, a low rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself. He did not yet know what he was hearing. The German Sixth Army had entered Stalingrad 4 months earlier, expecting swift victory. The city that bore Stalin's name would fall, they believed, within weeks. Maps had shown industrial districts, railway junctions, strategic river crossings, all the ingredients of military significance. What the maps had not shown was the will embedded in every frozen brick, the resolve that turned rubble into fortress and desperation into doctrine. By mid-January, over 200,000 German soldiers found themselves encircled, their supply lines severed, their confidence shattered against something they had never encountered before, an enemy that refused the logic of defeat. But this is not a story about Soviet resistance alone. Hidden in the chaos of Stalingrad's final months was a smaller drama, one that would confuse German intelligence officers for weeks and reshape their understanding of the war they thought they knew. American forces, advisors, observers, liaison officers attached to Soviet commands, had been present in limited numbers since late 1942, part of the Lend-Lease cooperation that funneled supplies and expertise eastward. The Wehrmacht had dismissed them as symbolic, a political gesture with no tactical weight. They were wrong. The Germans had imagined Americans as they appeared in their propaganda films, soft-bodied, mechanically dependent, creatures of comfort unsuited to real war. The German soldiers who had fought across Poland, France, and deep into Russia considered themselves tempered by hardship, forged in the crucible of modern warfare. They had conquered nations, crossed rivers, and endured winters that broke lesser men. They expected Americans, when they finally met them, to crumble under the first sustained pressure, to retreat toward their supply depots and heated tents, to negotiate rather than endure. What they encountered in Stalingrad was something else entirely. On January 19th, a German reconnaissance unit advancing through the Barricadi factory district reported contact with a mixed Soviet-American position entrenched in the remains of a power station. The initial assault assumed the defenders would withdraw under artillery bombardment. They did not. The shelling intensified. The position held. When German infantry advanced at dawn, they found American soldiers fighting from foxholes carved into frozen concrete, their rifles steady, their discipline intact. The attack failed. Then failed again. Oberst von Mellenthin, tasked with assessing enemy morale, interviewed survivors from the assault. What they described unsettled him. The American soldiers had not fought with the frenzied desperation of men cornered, nor with the ideological fervor that characterized Soviet defenders. They fought with something quieter and more disturbing, a kind of methodical competence, an assumption of eventual victory that seemed disconnected from the reality around them. One German corporal, his face gray with frostbite, said the Americans fought like they were defending Kansas, not Stalingrad, like they believed the war was already won. This belief, von Mellenthin realized, was the weapon. The historical record confirms what the Germans could not initially accept. American personnel in Stalingrad numbered fewer than 200. Engineers, signals officers, forward observers coordinating supply drops, and providing technical expertise for American-manufactured equipment. They were not a fighting force in the traditional sense, yet their presence carried disproportionate weight. Soviet commanders noted it. German intelligence struggled to explain it. The Americans brought with them an artifact that became the subject of bitter fascination among German troops: the K-ration. 3,000 calories. Compressed biscuits, canned meat, chocolate bars, cigarettes, chewing gum. Wrapped in waxed cardboard boxes, stacked in crates marked with stenciled eagles. The rations arrived by convoy across the frozen steppes, delivered to Soviet positions and shared among defenders. German soldiers, subsisting on frozen bread and horse meat, found these boxes on captured prisoners and in overrun positions. They opened them with something approaching reverence. One diary entry, recovered from the body of a Gefreiter in the 71st Infantry Division, describes finding a K-ration in a destroyed bunker. Inside was food enough for a day, more than I have eaten in a week. Chocolate that melted on my tongue, cigarettes that burned clean. I thought of home, and then I thought, how do you defeat a nation that sends chocolate to its soldiers in hell? The K-ration became symbol and cipher. It represented not merely abundance, but a different kind of civilization. The Germans had built their war machine on discipline and sacrifice, on the belief that hardship forged strength. The Americans seemed to operate from a contrary principle, that strength came from confidence, and confidence from the assurance that your nation could deliver hot food, warm socks, and replacement ammunition whenever you needed it. This was not the enemy the Wehrmacht had prepared to fight. By late January, the situation inside Stalingrad had deteriorated beyond salvage. The German Sixth Army's perimeter contracted daily. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies vanished. Rations dwindled to starvation levels. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commanding from a basement command post, received Hitler's orders to fight to the last man. The orders made no operational sense. Surrender was forbidden. Retreat was impossible. All that remained was the logic of sacrifice. Yet the American positions did not collapse. German officers monitoring radio intercepts reported something peculiar. The American voices on Soviet command frequencies maintained steady, almost casual tones. They requested supplies, reported positions, coordinated defensive fires, all with the calm cadence of men executing routine tasks. There was no panic, no desperation, no acknowledgement that they were surrounded in a frozen city on the edge of obliteration. This, more than firepower or tactical skill, eroded German morale. Soldiers can endure hardship when they believe their enemy suffers equally. They can accept sacrifice if they see it mirrored across the battlefield. But the Americans in Stalingrad presented a different psychological equation. They seemed untouched by the existential dread that consumed the Wehrmacht. They fought not with the grim determination of cornered men, but with the patient confidence of those who knew reinforcements would come, supplies would arrive, and victory was inevitable, even if delayed. The Germans had no frame of reference for this. On January 26th, Soviet forces split the German pocket in two. The southern group, trapped near the city center, received orders to destroy equipment and prepare for final resistance. In the chaos of collapsing command structures, a German intelligence officer named Hauptmann Klaus Richter managed to transmit a final report to Army Group headquarters. His message, preserved in Wehrmacht archives, included this assessment: the Americans fight without hatred and without fear. They assume the war is already won and are merely performing the steps to conclusion. This psychological advantage is more devastating than their material superiority. Our men see it and lose faith. The transformation was complete, though few Germans could articulate it clearly. They had entered Russia believing in their own exceptionalism, in the superiority of their training and doctrine, in the inevitability of their triumph. Stalingrad did not merely defeat them militarily, it shattered the foundational assumption that hardship and will were sufficient. The Americans demonstrated a different truth, that industrial capacity, logistical mastery, and unshakable confidence in democratic systems could outlast any amount of individual courage. The K-ration, in this context, was never just food. It was a message transmitted in cardboard and chocolate. We can afford this. We can afford to feed our soldiers well in the worst conditions imaginable. We can afford to win. By February 2nd, the last German units in Stalingrad surrendered. 91,000 soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Among them were men who had fought beside Americans, who had watched them hold positions that should have broken, who had seen them share K-rations with Soviet allies and maintain radio discipline under artillery fire. These men carried home stories that would circulate through POW camps and, eventually, through the post-war consciousness of a defeated nation. They spoke of American abundance, yes, but also of something less tangible. A quality of certainty. A refusal to acknowledge the possibility of ultimate defeat. The Germans had a word for it, though it translates poorly. Selbstverständlichkeit. The quality of taking something for granted, of assuming it as naturally as breathing. The Americans took victory for granted. The epilogue writes itself in frozen mud and factory ruins. Decades after Stalingrad, historians would debate the battle's turning point, the encirclement, the failed relief attempts, the logistical collapse. But for the German soldiers who survived, the psychological turning point came earlier, in the moment they realized their enemy did not share their conception of war as existential struggle. The Americans fought as if the outcome was already determined, as if the battle was merely a procedural step in a larger narrative already written. This was the true weapon democracy deployed. Not tanks or planes or superior numbers, but the deep structural confidence that comes from knowing your nation can produce faster, supply better, and endure longer than any adversary. The Wehrmacht had built an army of warriors. America had built something stranger and more dangerous. An army of workers in uniform, men who approached war with the same pragmatic competence they brought to assembly lines and logistics networks. They did not need to believe in final victory through individual will. They believed in systems, in supply chains, in the inevitable mathematics of industrial production. In the basement where Oberst von Mellenthin first heard the rumble of American resistance, ice crystals formed on the walls like frozen breath. Outside, the city lay in ruins, its buildings pulverized, its streets clogged with debris and the frozen dead. But somewhere in that devastation, American soldiers ate chocolate and shared cigarettes and radioed grid coordinates with voices that never wavered. They had not come to Stalingrad to win a single battle. They had come to demonstrate a principle, that democratic capitalism, properly mobilized, could outproduce and outlast any ideology built on sacrifice and will alone. The Germans learned this lesson in real time, watching enemies who refused to accept the reality of their situation because they understood a deeper reality, that behind them stretched an industrial base so vast, so inexhaustible, that defeat was not a possibility, but a mathematical impossibility. This was the resistance German commanders could not believe, not the resistance of men fighting for survival, but the resistance of men fighting from certainty. The Americans never gave up because, in their fundamental understanding of the war, there was nothing to give up. The outcome was predetermined by factory production, shipping tonnage, and agricultural surplus. The fighting was just the process of making it official. In the end, Stalingrad fell, but the lesson remained. Frozen in memory like the Volga in winter. Carried home by survivors who had eaten American chocolate and seen American confidence and realized too late that they had been fighting the wrong kind of war all along. The K-rations were never just rations. They were prophecy, wrapped in waxed cardboard, delivered daily to men who never doubted the message printed in stenciled eagles. We can afford this. We can afford to win. We already have.